The courtroom buzzed as 78-year-old Isaiah Booker stood to face questions, his hands trembling slightly from age. Prosecutor Daniel Whitmore smiled before he even spoke, a smile that said he'd already won. He questioned whether Isaiah understood what perjury meant, and laughter rippled through the gallery. Whitmore built his entire case on one assumption: that this elderly black man with barely a middle school education couldn't possibly understand the complex financial documents he was accused of falsifying. The mockery came easy. The media reported it as fact, and even the judge seemed impatient. But sitting quietly in the back row, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit watched every calculated insult, and he knew something nobody else knew. They were about to mock a man whose hidden past would turn their assumptions into ashes. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in courtroom 7B, casting a harsh white glow across the weathered wooden benches packed with spectators. It was the kind of Tuesday morning where everyone seemed to have shown up, some out of curiosity, others drawn by the sensational headlines that have been circulating through the local news cycle. The air smelled faintly of old paper and furniture polish, mixed with the nervous energy of people waiting for something significant to happen. Isaiah Booker heard his name called by the bailiff, the sound cutting through the murmur of whispered conversations like a blade. He rose slowly from the defendant's table, his movements deliberate despite the slight tremor in his hands. At 78 years old, Isaiah had learned that speed wasn't always necessary. Steadiness was. His dark suit, though clearly borrowed and a size too large, hung neatly on his thin frame. His salt and pepper hair was cropped close to his scalp, and behind wire-rimmed glasses, his dark brown eyes held a quietness that some might mistake for confusion. The prosecutor, Daniel Whitmore, stood near the witness stand with the kind of posture that suggested he'd already won. He was in his early 40s, tall and athletic, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. His navy suit probably cost more than Isaiah's monthly rent. As Isaiah approached the witness stand, Whitmore's smile widened into something that looked more like a smirk. "Mr. Booker," Whitmore began, his voice dripping with a false politeness that everyone in the courtroom could hear. "Before we proceed, I need to establish something for the record. Do you understand what perjury means?" A few snickers rippled through the gallery. Isaiah's fingers tightened briefly on the railing of the witness box, but his expression remained calm. "Yes, sir," Isaiah replied quietly. "It means lying under oath. And you understand the consequences of that?" Whitmore pressed, his tone suggesting he was speaking to a child. "Edo." Whitmore nodded slowly, theatrically, as if he'd just accomplished something meaningful. "Good. I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page here. Sometimes legal terminology can be challenging for folks without formal education." More laughter. Isaiah noticed Judge Harrison, a stern-faced man in his 60s with graying temples, didn't intervene. The judge simply watched with an expression that suggested mild impatience, though whether with the prosecutor or the defendant wasn't entirely clear. "Your Honor," Isaiah said softly, raising one hand slightly. "May I answer more fully?" Judge Harrison sighed, glancing at the clock on the wall. "Make it brief, Mr. Booker. I understand what perjury means, sir. I understand the oath I took. And I understand that my words carry weight in this courtroom, regardless of where I learned their meaning." There was a brief silence. Whitmore's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before returning, brighter and sharper than before. "How noble," the prosecutor said, earning a few more chuckles. "Let's move forward, shall we?" From his seat at the defense table, Isaiah's court-appointed attorney, Mark Jenkins, shuffled through papers with the exhausted demeanor of someone who'd already argued 5 cases that week. Jenkins was in his 30s, with dark circles under his eyes and a tie that looked like it had been knotted in a rush. He didn't object to Whitmore's tone. He didn't even look up. The charges against Isaiah were straightforward, at least on paper. Financial fraud. Specifically, he was accused of falsifying documents related to a property transaction. Documents that, according to the prosecution, he couldn't possibly have understood. The paperwork was complex, filled with legal terminology and financial calculations. Whitmore had made that point several times already, each time with increasing emphasis. Mr. Booker, Whitmore continued, pacing slowly in front of the witness stand. You barely finished middle school, correct? Isaiah nodded. That's correct. No high school diploma. No FIDE. No college education of any kind. No, sir. And yet, Whitmore said, spreading his hands as if presenting a magic trick, you expect this court to believe you understood documents that would challenge someone with a law degree? Jenkins finally stirred at the defense table. Objection. Argumentative. Sustained. Judge Harrison said without much energy. Move along, Mr. Whitmore. But the damage was done. Isaiah could see it in the faces of the spectators, the subtle head shakes, the knowing glances exchanged between strangers. They'd already decided, in their minds, he was guilty not just of fraud, but of the arrogance to pretend he was something he wasn't. In the third row, near the aisle, a middle-aged white woman whispered to her companion, he probably didn't even know what he was signing. Her friend nodded. They take advantage of people like that. Sad, really. Isaiah heard them. He developed sharp ears over the years, a survival skill from a lifetime of needing to know what people really thought. But he didn't turn around. He kept his gaze forward, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Near the back of the courtroom, almost hidden in the last row, sat an older white man in an expensive charcoal suit. He was perhaps in his early 70s, with silver hair combed neatly back and a face that suggested he'd spent decades learning to reveal nothing. He didn't fidget. He didn't whisper. He simply watched, his pale blue eyes tracking every movement, every word, every subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Isaiah had noticed him on the first day of the trial. The man sat in the same seat each day, always alone, always observing. No legal pad, no visible reaction, just presence. Mr. Booker, Whitmore said, pulling Isaiah's attention back. Let me ask you this. When you were presented with these documents, he held up a stack of papers. Did someone read them to you? No, sir. Really? Whitmore's eyebrows rose dramatically. You read all of this yourself? Pages and pages of legal and financial terminology? I did my best to understand what I was signing, yes. Your best, Whitmore repeated, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. Tell me, Mr. Booker, when you were growing up in rural Mississippi in the 1950s, did you have access to many books? Jenkins looked up briefly, as if considering an objection, then looked back down at his papers. Not many, Isaiah admitted, but I read what I could find. What you could find, Whitmore echoed mockingly. And what kind of reading material was available to a young black boy in segregated Mississippi? Comic books? The Bible, perhaps? Objection, Jenkins said weakly. Relevance. I'm establishing the defendant's educational background, Your Honor, which is directly relevant to whether he could have understood the documents in question. Overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Booker. Isaiah took a slow breath. In his mind, he was somewhere else, a memory surfacing like light through deep water. He was 9 years old, sitting on the floor of his grandmother's house, teaching himself to read from newspapers that neighbors would pass along. His grandmother couldn't read herself, but she'd made him promise to learn. They can take everything from you, she'd told him, but what's in your head stays yours. I read what I could, Isaiah repeated quietly. Whatever was available. I see, Whitmore said, though his tone suggested he saw nothing at all. So you're self-taught, essentially. No formal training in reading comprehension, critical thinking, or analytical skills. I suppose that's one way to put it. It's the only way to put it, Mr. Booker. Whitmore turned to face the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, we have here a man with barely a sixth-grade education, self-taught from scraps of newspaper and old books, claiming to understand complex financial documents that lawyers study for years to comprehend. Does that seem reasonable to you? Judge Harrison cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore, save your closing arguments for closing. Of course, Your Honor. But Whitmore was grinning now, and the courtroom's energy had shifted entirely in his favor. When court adjourned for the day, Isaiah walked slowly down the courthouse steps, flanked by Jenkins, who was already on his phone coordinating his next case. The evening air was cool, a relief after the stuffiness of the courtroom. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the darkening sky. A reporter thrust a microphone toward Isaiah's face. "Mr. Booker, do you have any comment on today's testimony?" Jenkins stepped between them. "No comment. Please respect my client's privacy." But as they pushed past, Isaiah heard the reporter speaking into her camera. "The trial of Isaiah Booker continues tomorrow, with prosecutors painting a picture of a defendant who may have been in over his head, unable to understand the very documents at the center of this case." That night, sitting alone in his small apartment, Isaiah saw his face on the 10 o'clock news. The headline beneath his photo read, "Fraud Suspect Claims Understanding of Complex Documents Despite Limited Education." The news anchor, a young woman with perfectly styled hair, spoke in measured tones. "The prosecution argues that Booker, who never completed high school, couldn't have possibly comprehended the financial paperwork involved in the alleged fraud scheme. Legal experts say this case highlights the vulnerability of undereducated individuals in complex financial transactions." Isaiah turned off the television. In the silence of his living room, surrounded by the modest furniture he'd accumulated over decades, he let himself feel what he couldn't show in court. Not anger exactly, but a deep, familiar weariness. He'd survived worse than mockery. He'd survived Jim Crow, survived being denied opportunities, survived watching men with half his intelligence rise above him simply because of the color of their skin. But surviving and accepting were different things. His phone buzzed. A text message from a number he recognized but hadn't heard from in years. His daughter, Rachel. She'd been watching the trial online, following the coverage from 3 states away where she'd built a life that didn't include him. The message was short. "Dad, I saw the news. Are you okay?" Isaiah stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed back, "I'm fine, sweetheart. Don't worry about me." The next morning, Isaiah returned to courtroom 7B. The same faces filled the gallery, hungry for drama. The same prosecutor stood ready to perform. The same judge sat elevated above them all. And in the same seat in the back row, the silver-haired man in the charcoal suit watched and waited. Whitmore wasted no time. "Your Honor, I'd like to revisit the defendant's testimony from yesterday." "Proceed." "Mr. Booker," Whitmore began, his voice sharp with renewed confidence. "Yesterday you claimed to have read and understood the documents in question. Today, I'd like to test that understanding." He approached the witness stand with a single sheet of paper. "Can you read this paragraph aloud for the court?" Isaiah took the paper and read clearly, his voice steady despite the prosecutor's obvious hope that he would stumble. "Very good," Whitmore said with exaggerated praise. "You can read words, but reading and understanding are 2 very different things, aren't they? Let me ask you this. What does amortization mean?" "It's the process of paying off debt in regular installments over time." Whitmore's jaw tightened slightly. "Lucky guess. How about escrow? A financial arrangement where a third party holds money or documents until specific conditions are met." The courtroom had gone quiet. Jenkins looked up from his papers, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Whitmore's smile had frozen into something harder. "You memorized definitions," the prosecutor said dismissively. "That doesn't mean you understand their application." "Objection," Jenkins said, standing for the first time with something resembling energy. "Is there a question, or is counsel simply making speeches?" Sustained. "Mr. Whitmore, ask your questions." But Whitmore had already recovered his stride. "Mr. Booker, where did you learn these definitions? Did someone coach you for this trial?" "No, sir. I learned them the same way I learned most things, by necessity." "By necessity," Whitmore repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "How convenient. Tell me, when you were working your various jobs over the years, and I see here you've been a janitor, a warehouse worker, a groundskeeper, did any of those positions require knowledge of financial terminology?" Isaiah paused. This was dangerous territory. Some jobs required more paperwork than others. "Paperwork," Whitmore scoffed. "Like timesheets? Attendance records?" He turned to the jury with a knowing look. I think we can all agree that's quite different from understanding a complex property transaction. The judge interrupted, his voice sharp. Mr. Booker, answer only the questions asked. Mr. Whitmore, move this along. But the pattern had been established. For the next hour, Whitmore methodically dismantled Isaiah's credibility, not through evidence, but through insinuation and mockery. He questioned whether Isaiah had been taken advantage of by others, suggested that he'd been manipulated into signing documents he couldn't comprehend, and repeatedly emphasized his lack of formal education. Did someone read the paperwork to you? Whitmore asked at one point. Like a bedtime story, perhaps. Laughter erupted in the gallery. Judge Harrison banged his gavel half-heartedly, but he didn't rebuke the prosecutor. Isaiah sat motionless, his hands folded, his expression giving nothing away. During a brief recess, Jenkins pulled Isaiah aside in the hallway. Listen, I know this is rough, but we need to consider a plea deal. The prosecutor is eating us alive in there. I didn't do what they're accusing me of, Isaiah said quietly. I believe you, Jenkins said, though his tone suggested otherwise. But belief doesn't win cases. Evidence does, and right now, the optics are terrible. The jury sees an elderly black man with no education claiming to understand documents that most people would need help with. It plays right into every stereotype. Then we fight harder. Jenkins sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. With what? We don't have expert witnesses. We don't have character witnesses lined up. We have you, and forgive me for saying this, but you're not coming across as credible to them. Isaiah met his attorney's gaze steadily. I'm coming across exactly as I am. If that's not enough, then the system was never going to give me a fair chance anyway. Back in the courtroom, the afternoon session brought more of the same. Whitmore introduced selectively chosen details from Isaiah's past. Addresses in poor neighborhoods, jobs that required no advanced education, gaps in employment that the prosecutor suggested were suspicious. He painted a picture of a man who'd lived on the margins, someone who might be desperate enough to commit fraud if the opportunity arose. You've struggled financially most of your life, haven't you, Mr. Booker? Whitmore asked. I've worked hard for everything I have. That's not what I asked. You've had periods where you couldn't make rent, correct? Times when you needed government assistance. Jenkins stood. Objection. The defendant's financial history isn't on trial here. It speaks to motive, Your Honor. Overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Booker. Yes, Isaiah said quietly. There were difficult times. Difficult times, Whitmore repeated. Times when a complicated financial scheme might have seemed like a way out. I never looked for illegal ways out of anything. But the seed had been planted. Isaiah could see it in the jurors' faces. Doubt mixing with pity, a toxic combination that would be hard to overcome. Judge Harrison interrupted again, this time cutting Isaiah off mid-sentence when he tried to explain the context of a particular document. Mr. Booker, please answer only what's asked. We don't have time for life stories. The message was clear. Isaiah's voice, his explanations, his perspective, none of it mattered as much as the narrative Whitmore was constructing. The courtroom had already decided what kind of person Isaiah was, and nothing he said was going to change that. When that day's session ended, Isaiah walked past reporters who shouted questions he didn't answer. He rode the bus home, sitting near the back, watching the city slide past the windows. At a stoplight, he saw his face on a newspaper in someone's hands. He couldn't read the headline from where he sat, but he could imagine it. That evening, his daughter called instead of texting. Rachel's voice was tight with emotion. Dad, I've been watching the trial online. This prosecutor, the way he's treating you. It's all right, Rachel. It's not all right. He's humiliating you. Everyone's laughing. The comments online are, she stopped herself. I should be there. You have your own life. You're my father. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of distance. Rachel had left home at 18, eager to escape the limitations she saw in Isaiah's life. She'd gone to college, built a career, married a man who'd never known poverty. She'd succeeded in ways Isaiah never could, and somewhere along the way, that success had created a gulf between them that neither knew how to cross. I'll be fine, Isaiah said finally. I promise. After they hung up, Isaiah sat in his small living room, remembering a conversation from decades ago. Rachel had been 12, frustrated with math homework. "Why do I need to learn this?" she'd asked. "You didn't go to college, and you're doing okay." He'd looked at her with an intensity that made her pay attention. "I'm surviving, baby girl. That's different from thriving. You learn everything they'll teach you. Everything. Because the world will try to tell you who you can be based on where you came from. Don't you ever let them." Now, watching the city lights flicker through his window, Isaiah wondered if he'd been preparing her for his own battle all along. The next morning brought more of the same. Whitmore was relentless, and the courtroom had settled into a rhythm of mockery and dismissal. But something had shifted, subtle as a change in air pressure before a storm. The silver-haired man in the back row had moved, not to a different seat, but forward in his chair, more visible now. Several times during testimony, Isaiah caught Whitmore glancing toward the back of the room, though the prosecutor gave no indication of concern. Jenkins filed a motion late on the third night, working past midnight in his cramped office. He'd noticed inconsistencies in the prosecution's timeline, small things, but potentially significant. When he presented the motion the next morning, Whitmore barely looked at it. "Your Honor, this motion is a desperate attempt to muddy clear waters. The defense is grasping at straws because they have no legitimate defense. It raises valid questions about," Jenkins started. "Valid questions?" Whitmore cut him off with a laugh. "Counsel, with all due respect, your client couldn't raise a valid question about astrophysics either. But that doesn't mean we need to investigate NASA." The courtroom erupted in laughter. Judge Harrison banged his gavel, but he was smiling too. "Mr. Whitmore, that's enough. Though I have to say, the motion does seem thin. I'll take it under advisement." Jenkins slumped back into his chair. Isaiah remained still, his eyes focused on something or someone in the middle distance. That afternoon, a court clerk named Patricia Morrison noticed something strange while organizing files. She was in her 50s, a woman who'd worked in the courthouse for 25 years and prided herself on attention to detail. There were documents in the evidence file that referenced records she'd flagged weeks ago as potentially exculpatory, records that should have been disclosed to the defense. She approached her supervisor quietly, pointing out the discrepancy. "These were subpoenaed. Where are the originals?" Her supervisor, a hairy man named Tom, who'd worked with Whitmore on several cases, barely looked up. "Probably misfiled. Everything relevant is in the evidence log. But these specifically reference Mr. Booker's employment history. The defense should have access to." "Patricia, we have 3 trials running concurrently. If you have time to chase paper trails, I can find more productive uses for your day." She walked away, but the unease stayed with her. That evening, working late to catch up on filing, she noticed Whitmore leaving the records room with a folder. Nothing unusual about that. Attorneys reviewed evidence all the time. But something about his expression, the quick way he glanced around before leaving, struck her as odd. Meanwhile, in the courtroom during the 4th day of trial, Isaiah made a simple request. "Your Honor, may I take a brief recess?" Judge Harrison checked his watch. "We just came back from lunch, Mr. Booker." "Yes, sir. I apologize. Just a few minutes." "Make it quick." In the hallway outside the courtroom, Isaiah stood near a window overlooking the parking lot. To anyone watching, he appeared to be alone, gathering his thoughts. But in a recessed alcove nearby, he spoke quietly with someone the spectators hadn't seen leave the courtroom. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. No one overheard what was said. When court resumed, the silver-haired man in the back row stood for the first time since the trial began. He whispered something to a court officer, who nodded and approached the bench. The officer handed Judge Harrison a folded note. Whitmore noticed the exchange and rolled his eyes. "Your Honor, are we expecting more interruptions? Some of us have actual work to do." A few spectators chuckled, but the sound died quickly. Something in the judge's expression had changed as he read the note. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He folded the paper carefully and set it aside. "Continue your examination, Mr. Whitmore." The prosecutor launched into what he clearly intended to be his final, devastating attack. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's be honest about what we're seeing here. We have a defendant who, through no fault of his own, lacked access to proper education. This is a tragedy, certainly, but it doesn't give him the right to claim expertise he doesn't possess. He turned to face Isaiah directly. Mr. Booker, I want to be very clear. No one is mocking your lack of education. What we're questioning is your attempt to present yourself as something you're not, as someone capable of understanding documents that would challenge people with law degrees and business experience. Isaiah met his gaze without blinking. I understand that's your belief, sir. It's not a belief. It's a fact. You didn't go to school. You didn't study law or finance. You worked manual labor jobs your entire life. There is no shame in that, but there is shame in lying about your capabilities to commit fraud. Objection. Jenkins was on his feet now, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Counsel is testifying, not questioning. Sustained. Mr. Whitmore, final warning. But Whitmore was building to his crescendo. Your Honor, the prosecution has demonstrated beyond any doubt that this defendant lacked the education, the training, and the intellectual capacity to understand the documents at the center of this case. We've shown a pattern of financial desperation, a history of jobs requiring no specialized knowledge, and a defendant who, frankly, appears confused by basic legal terminology when pressed. Isaiah listened to every word, his expression unchanged. No anger, no fear, just a patience that seemed infinite, as if he'd been preparing for this moment his entire life. Patricia Morrison sat in the gallery, watching. The unease she'd felt about the missing documents had grown into something she couldn't ignore. During Whitmore's speech, she noticed him glancing repeatedly toward the back of the room, where the silver-haired man sat. Was it her imagination, or did the prosecutor seem less confident than before? Judge Harrison cleared his throat. The courtroom fell silent. Before we proceed to closing arguments, the judge said, his voice carrying an unusual weight, I've been asked to allow an unexpected statement. The court will hear it. Whitmore's head snapped up. Your Honor, we're in the middle of. You've had your say, Mr. Whitmore. Sit down. The prosecutor sat, but his confidence had evaporated like morning fog. For the first time since the trial began, he looked unsettled, not afraid yet, but no longer certain of his victory. Isaiah sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, and waited for what came next. The morning after Judge Harrison's unexpected announcement, the courtroom filled earlier than usual. Word had spread that something unusual was happening in the Booker trial, and spectators who'd grown comfortable with the predictable rhythm of mockery now sensed a shift. The air felt different, charged with a tension that made people lean forward in their seats rather than settling back comfortably. Mark Jenkins arrived with actual energy for the first time in days. He'd spent most of the previous night reviewing documents, following a thread that Isaiah had quietly pointed him toward during their brief hallway conversation. What he'd found wasn't dramatic. Not yet. But it was enough to make him wonder if he'd been missing something obvious all along. The document in question was a receipt, time-stamped and notarized, that contradicted the prosecution's timeline by nearly 3 hours. According to Whitmore's case, Isaiah had signed the allegedly fraudulent paperwork at 2 in the afternoon on March 15th. But this receipt, buried in a stack of discovery materials that Jenkins had initially skimmed past, showed Isaiah had been across town at a medical appointment during that exact time window. Jenkins had filed it as part of his motion, highlighting the discrepancy. Now, as the judge took his seat and court came to order, he waited to see if anyone would take it seriously. Whitmore stood, straightening his expensive tie with the casual confidence of someone who'd never lost a case he cared about. Your Honor, before we address whatever procedural matter has been raised, I'd like to complete my examination of the defendant. The court will address the motion first, Judge Harrison replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Whitmore's smile tightened. Of course, Your Honor. Jenkins presented his findings, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. This receipt proves Mr. Booker couldn't have been at the location where the prosecution claims the documents were signed. The timeline doesn't work. Whitmore barely glanced at the document. Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of confusion I've been trying to prevent. Mr. Booker clearly doesn't understand the documents he's presenting. That receipt is from a different date, March 5th, not 15th. It's a simple reading error. Actually, Jenkins said, finding his footing, if you look at the date stamp format, the facility uses day-month-year notation, which is common in medical record systems. The date is 15th March, not 5th March. For a moment, genuine uncertainty flickered across Whitmore's face. But he recovered quickly, laughing it off. Even if we accept that interpretation, it proves nothing. The signing could have occurred later that day. The notarization timestamp on the alleged fraudulent documents says 2:14 p.m., Jenkins countered. Mr. Booker's medical appointment documentation shows he was in that facility from 1:30 to 3:45 that afternoon. The courtroom had gone quiet. This wasn't the confused, easily dismissed defense they'd grown used to. This was actual evidence, presented clearly and backed by documentation. Judge Harrison examined the papers himself. Mr. Whitmore, do you have an explanation for this discrepancy? I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation, Your Honor. Perhaps the notarization time is incorrect. Perhaps Mr. Booker arranged for someone else to sign in his place, and now he's using this appointment as cover. That's speculation, Jenkins said. So, is the defense's interpretation of this receipt? Whitmore's voice had an edge now, sharper than before. Your Honor, we can't let this trial be derailed by creative readings of irrelevant documents. The defendant has shown repeatedly that he struggles with understanding paperwork. Now, suddenly he's produced a receipt that conveniently contradicts our timeline. This deserves skepticism, not serious consideration. Isaiah watched from the defendant's table, his expression unchanged. But inside, he felt something shift, the smallest loosening of the vice that had been tightening around him for days. Judge Harrison set the papers down. The prosecution will need to address this discrepancy. I'm not dismissing it as irrelevant. But, Your Honor, I've made my ruling, Mr. Whitmore. The judge's tone carried a warning. Now, I believe we have another matter to address. The statement that was requested yesterday. The silver-haired man in the back row stood slowly, buttoning his charcoal suit jacket. Every eye in the courtroom turned to watch as he moved down the center aisle with measured, deliberate steps. His posture was military straight, his expression neutral but alert. When he reached the front of the courtroom, he didn't approach the witness stand, but instead positioned himself near the prosecution's table. Your Honor, he said, his voice carrying easily through the room despite not being raised. My name is Mr. Harris. I'm here as an observer with a standing interest in this case. Whitmore let out an exasperated breath. Your Honor, who is this person? We can't just have random spectators interrupting proceedings. I'm not a random spectator, Mr. Whitmore. Harris's tone remained calm, almost pleasant. I've been observing this trial since it began, and I believe the court has been operating under significant misapprehensions regarding Mr. Booker's background and capabilities. Oh, wonderful, Whitmore said, not bothering to hide his sarcasm. A character witness from the retirement home. Your Honor, this is absurd. A few people in the gallery laughed nervously, but the sound died quickly. There was something about Harris's presence, the way he stood, the certainty in his bearing, that didn't match Whitmore's dismissive characterization. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly. Mr. Harris, you'll need to be more specific about your interest in this case. Of course, Your Honor. I believe the prosecution has built its entire case on a false premise. Specifically, that Mr. Booker lacks the education and intellectual capacity to understand the documents in question. Harris paused, letting his words settle. That premise is incorrect, and I can provide documentation to prove it. Whitmore stood abruptly. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defendant's education history is a matter of public record. We've established that he barely completed middle school, worked manual labor positions his entire life, and has no formal credentials of any kind. Whatever this gentleman thinks he knows is irrelevant to the established facts. The facts, Mr. Whitmore, are more complex than you've presented. Harris reached into his jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope. I'd like to request that the court review these documents in chambers before we proceed. Judge Harrison hesitated. This was unusual territory, and his expression showed his uncertainty. But something in Harris's demeanor, the quiet confidence, the specific language he used, suggested this wasn't a waste of time. Very well. We'll take a brief recess while I review these materials. He looked directly at Whitmore. All parties will wait. The courtroom erupted in whispers as the judge retired to his chambers. Whitmore stood near his table, arms crossed, his jaw working as he stared at Harris. The older man had returned to his seat in the back row, once again unreadable. Jenkins leaned toward Isaiah. Do you know what that was about? Isaiah's response was quiet. I think we're about to find out. Patricia Morrison, the court clerk, watched the exchange with growing certainty about what she'd seen in the records room. She'd spent the previous evening reviewing file logs, cross-referencing what should have been in the evidence disclosure with what actually was. The discrepancies weren't small. Entire sections of Isaiah's employment history had been removed from the materials provided to the defense. She documented everything, but hadn't yet decided what to do with that information. Now, watching Harris's intervention, she felt the weight of her own knowledge pressing down. If she was right about what Whitmore had done, this trial was built on more than just bias. It was built on deliberate deception. The recess stretched to 20 minutes, then 30. Whitmore paced near the windows, his earlier confidence eroding with each passing minute. Jenkins tried to ask Isaiah questions, but the elderly man simply shook his head slightly. "We wait," was all he said. When Judge Harrison finally returned, his demeanor had changed completely. His face was carefully neutral, but there was a rigidity in his posture that hadn't been there before. He avoided looking directly at Whitmore as he took his seat. "The court has reviewed the submitted materials," he began, his voice formal and clipped. "Mr. Whitmore, I need to ask you directly. Were you aware of Mr. Booker's employment history between 1971 and 1993? Whitmore's expression shifted through several emotions: confusion, irritation, then something that looked like concern. "Your Honor, the defendant worked various manual labor positions during that period. It's all on the record." "That's not what I asked. Were you aware of the specific nature of his employment during those years?" "I reviewed his employment history as it was provided in discovery, yes." Judge Harrison's jaw tightened. "Mr. Harris, would you care to elaborate for the court?" Harris stood again, his movements unhurried. "Your Honor, Mr. Booker's employment record during that period shows he worked for a specialized federal documentation unit. His role required extensive training in financial analysis, legal document review, and forensic examination of complex paperwork. This information was available through federal employment records and should have been included in the discovery materials provided to the defense." The courtroom exploded in shocked murmurs. Jenkins's head snapped toward Isaiah, his expression one of complete disbelief. Whitmore had gone pale, his confident posture crumbling. "That's—" Whitmore started, then stopped, seeming to recalculate. "Your Honor, I have no knowledge of any federal employment. The defendant's work history shows janitorial positions, warehouse work. Because those were the only records included in the materials you disclosed." Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice sharp. "Mr. Harris, you mentioned documentation?" "Yes, Your Honor. I have federal employment records, training certifications, and performance evaluations spanning 22 years. I can also provide testimony as to Mr. Booker's capabilities during that period, as I was his direct supervisor for 15 of those years." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the usual shuffle of papers and whispered conversations had ceased. Every person in that courtroom was trying to process what they'd just heard. Whitmore found his voice, though it had lost its earlier smoothness. "Your Honor, I need time to verify these claims. This information was never disclosed to the prosecution either." "Wasn't it?" Judge Harrison's tone had grown cold. "Mr. Whitmore, did you personally review all discovery materials provided by the defense?" "Of course, Your Honor, but—" "And did you conduct an independent investigation into the defendant's background beyond what was provided?" Whitmore hesitated just a fraction too long. The defense's disclosure seemed comprehensive. "Seemed," the judge repeated. Mr. Harris, these records you've provided, they indicate that a formal request for employment history was made through proper channels 2 months ago. Do you have confirmation of that request? I do, Your Honor. The request was filed by the defense and should have been fulfilled within 3 weeks. The documents in question were compiled and made available for inclusion in discovery. Jenkins was on his feet now, anger replacing his usual exhaustion. Your Honor, I filed that request. I never received those documents. I was told the federal employment search returned no results for Mr. Booker. All eyes turned to Whitmore. The prosecutor had moved to his table, rifling through papers with movements that looked more panicked than purposeful. There must be some administrative error. I never saw these records. If they weren't provided to me, I couldn't have disclosed them. Judge Harrison's expression suggested he was deciding something significant. We're going to adjourn early today. Tomorrow morning, I want a full accounting of the discovery process. Mr. Whitmore, you'll provide documentation of every step of the federal employment record request. Mr. Harris, you'll make your complete documentation available to both parties. And someone is going to explain to me how a defendant's 22-year employment history with the federal government simply disappeared from this case. As the judge's gavel came down, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters rushed for the exits, already calling in the story. Spectators who'd laughed at Isaiah days earlier now stared at him with expressions ranging from confusion to shame. Jenkins sat heavily in his chair, looking at his client as if seeing him for the first time. Isaiah remained seated, his hands still folded, his expression unchanged. Only the slight relaxation in his shoulders suggested any internal reaction to what had just occurred. Whitmore gathered his materials with jerky, uncoordinated movements, his earlier grace completely gone. He didn't look toward Isaiah or Harris as he left the courtroom, flanked by 2 junior attorneys who'd been assisting him and now looked deeply uncertain about their association with the case. In the hallway outside, Patricia Morrison approached Harris as he waited by the elevators. Mr. Harris? I'm Patricia Morrison. I work in the clerk's office. He turned to her with a slight nod. Ms. Morrison, I think there's something you should know. She glanced around, making sure no one was close enough to overhear. I've been tracking the evidence files for this case. Documents were removed from the discovery materials about 6 weeks ago. I flagged it at the time, but I was told it was an administrative correction. Harris's expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened. Who authorized the removal? That's the thing. The log shows Mr. Whitmore's access code. He personally checked out the files and returned them with sections missing. I documented everything. Ms. Morrison, would you be willing to testify to that if asked? She took a breath, then nodded. I think I have to. That evening, the story broke across every local news channel. The headlines had shifted dramatically from the previous day's coverage. Prosecutor's case against elderly defendant collapses after hidden federal career revealed. Questions raised about withheld evidence in high-profile fraud trial. Who was Isaiah Booker? Federal records paint different picture than prosecution claimed. Rachel Booker saw the news on her phone while sitting in her office 3 states away. She immediately booked a flight for the next morning. Whatever distance had existed between her and her father, whatever complicated history they shared, none of it mattered anymore. He'd faced this alone long enough. Isaiah watched the news coverage in his small apartment, the blue glow of the television reflecting off his glasses. A reporter stood outside the courthouse, speaking earnestly into the camera. Legal experts say this dramatic turn raises serious questions not just about the prosecution's case, but about how the trial was conducted from the beginning. If Mr. Booker indeed worked in federal document analysis for over 2 decades, the entire foundation of the state's argument, that he lacked the capability to understand the paperwork in question, may have been built on withheld information. His phone rang. It was Jenkins, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and something that might have been guilt. Mr. Booker, I owe you an apology. I should have pushed harder on that federal employment request. I should have. You did the best you could with what you had, Isaiah said quietly. That's all anyone can do. But if I'd been more thorough, more aggressive. Mr. Jenkins, You're a good man working in a broken system with too many cases and not enough time. This isn't on you." After they hung up, Isaiah sat in the darkness of his living room, thinking about the years he'd spent in that federal position. Years of careful, meticulous work that no one had ever acknowledged because it was easier to see him as just another janitor, just another invisible black man doing work that didn't require thought. He'd documented fraud schemes, analyzed financial crimes, and trained younger analysts who'd gone on to bigger positions while he'd remained in the same role, passed over for promotion again and again despite his performance reviews. When the federal program had been quietly discontinued in the early 90s, its workers had scattered. Most found other government positions. Isaiah, in his 50s by then and exhausted by decades of being overlooked, had taken the buyout and found simpler work. He told himself he was done fighting to be seen. But fighting to be seen and fighting to survive were different things. And now, whether he'd wanted it or not, he was being seen. The next morning, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Security had to turn people away at the door. Every major news outlet had sent reporters. The public gallery included faces Isaiah had never seen before, people who'd heard about the case and wanted to witness what happened next. Whitmore entered through a side door, avoiding the main hallway where reporters had congregated. His face was composed, but there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested a sleepless night. He'd come prepared, carrying boxes of files that his assistants helped arrange on the prosecution's table. Judge Harrison called the court to order, his expression grave. "Before we proceed, I want to address what occurred yesterday. This court takes the discovery process seriously. Any failure to disclose exculpatory evidence is a serious matter that affects not just this case, but the integrity of our judicial system." Whitmore stood. "Your Honor, if I may address the court?" "You'll have your chance, Mr. Whitmore. First, I want to hear from Mr. Harris regarding the documentation he's provided." Harris took the witness stand, his bearing formal but not stiff. Under questioning from Jenkins, who was finally beginning to find his stride, Harris laid out Isaiah's employment history in detail. He'd started in 1971 as an entry-level document analyst, despite having no college degree. The program had been experimental, designed to recruit people with analytical minds regardless of formal education. Mr. Booker demonstrated an exceptional ability to identify patterns in financial documents, Harris testified. He could spot irregularities that others with more traditional training missed. Over time, he became one of our most reliable analysts for complex cases. And his training? Jenkins asked. Extensive. He completed over 3,000 hours of specialized instruction in financial analysis, legal document interpretation, forensic accounting principles, and evidentiary standards. By the mid-'80s, he was training new recruits. Jenkins presented certification documents, training records, and performance evaluations. Each one painted a picture completely contrary to everything Whitmore had argued. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Isaiah's hidden history unfolded. When Whitmore finally got his chance to cross-examine, he came out swinging. "Mr. Harris, isn't it true that this federal program you're describing was shut down because of questions about its effectiveness?" "No, it was shut down due to budget cuts and political restructuring. The work itself was highly successful. But Mr. Booker never rose above an entry-level position in 22 years. Doesn't that suggest limited competence?" Harris's expression hardened. "It suggests discrimination, Mr. Whitmore. Mr. Booker was passed over for promotion repeatedly despite exemplary performance reviews. That says more about the system than about his capabilities." Whitmore tried several more angles, but each one fell flat. The documentation was too thorough, the testimony too specific. Finally, he shifted tactics. "Your Honor, even if we accept all of this, and I'm not conceding that we should, it doesn't change the fundamental facts of the case. Mr. Booker is still accused of signing fraudulent documents. His past employment, however impressive it may have been decades ago, doesn't prove his innocence." "No," Judge Harrison agreed, "but it does fundamentally undermine your assertion that he lacked the capacity to understand those documents. And it raises serious questions about why this information wasn't disclosed." Your Honor, I've reviewed my files thoroughly. I received the discovery materials from multiple sources. If these federal records weren't included, it wasn't due to any action on my part. Actually, Patricia Morrison's voice cut through the courtroom. That's not accurate. Every head turned. The clerk stood near the back, having entered quietly during Harris's testimony. She looked nervous but determined. Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose. Ms. Morrison, Your Honor, I need to report a procedural irregularity. I've been reviewing the file logs for this case, and I've discovered that documents were removed from the discovery materials approximately 6 weeks ago. The access logs show that Mr. Whitmore personally checked out the files and returned them with significant sections missing. The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison's gavel came down hard multiple times before order was restored. Whitmore had gone pale again, his mouth opening and closing without sound. That's not, he finally managed. Your Honor, I reviewed files as part of normal trial preparation. I may have reorganized materials, but I certainly didn't intentionally withhold exculpatory evidence. Ms. Morrison, the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet. Do you have documentation of these access logs? Yes, Your Honor. I brought copies. She approached the bench with a folder, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. Judge Harrison reviewed the documents in silence. The courtroom waited, the tension almost unbearable. When he finally looked up, his expression was one of barely contained anger. Mr. Whitmore, I'm going to ask you one more time. Did you knowingly withhold evidence of Mr. Booker's federal employment history from the defense? Whitmore's face had taken on a grayish tint. Your Honor, there may have been an error in judgment about what was relevant, but an error in judgment. The judge's voice could have cut glass. You built an entire case on the defendant's alleged lack of education and capability, while in possession of documents proving he spent 2 decades in federal document analysis. And you call that an error in judgment? Your Honor, please. Enough. Judge Harrison stood, his robes swirling around him. This court will recess until 2 o'clock this afternoon. Mr. Whitmore, you will report to my chambers immediately with your supervising attorney. Ms. Morrison, I'll need your complete documentation. Mr. Jenkins, please prepare a motion for dismissal. We'll address all of this when we reconvene. As the judge left the bench, the courtroom dissolved into chaos. Reporters shouted questions. Spectators surged forward, trying to get closer to Isaiah or Whitmore or anyone involved in the case. Security struggled to maintain order. Isaiah sat quietly through it all, his hands still folded, his expression still calm. But when Rachel pushed through the crowd and threw her arms around him, he finally allowed himself a small, private smile. I'm here, Dad, she whispered. I should have been here from the beginning. You're here now, he replied. That's what matters. Whitmore left through the side door, surrounded by attorneys and security. His career, built on confidence and courtroom dominance, was crumbling around him. The case he'd thought would be a simple win had become the biggest mistake of his professional life. And in the back of the courtroom, Harris watched it all unfold with the same neutral expression he'd worn since the trial began, patient, observant, and absolutely certain of what came next. The afternoon session brought a different energy to courtroom 7B. The morning's revelations had fundamentally altered not just the case, but the atmosphere itself. Where spectators had once leaned back comfortably, assured of the outcome, they now sat forward with the nervous attention of people who'd realized they'd badly misjudged something important. The reporters who'd been covering what they thought was a simple fraud trial now recognized they were witnessing something far more significant, a complete dismantling of prosecutorial overreach. Judge Harrison entered at precisely 2 o'clock, his expression carved from granite. He'd spent his lunch hour in chambers with Whitmore and the prosecutor's supervising attorney, and whatever had been discussed there had clearly not improved his mood. When he took his seat, the usual casual rustling and whispering that accompanied a judge's entrance was completely absent. The courtroom held its collective breath. Before we proceed, the judge began, his voice carrying the weight of formal authority. I want to address what this court learned this morning. The discovery process is not merely a procedural formality. It is the foundation of our adversarial system. When evidence is withheld, whether through negligence or intent, it doesn't just harm one defendant. It undermines every citizen's faith in equal justice. Whitmore sat at the prosecution table, his posture rigid. Gone was the relaxed confidence, the easy smile, the casual dominance he'd displayed throughout the trial. His hands rested flat on the table in front of him, and he stared straight ahead, avoiding eye contact with anyone. "Mr. Harris," Judge Harrison continued, "the court would like to hear more detailed testimony regarding Mr. Booker's background and qualifications. Please take the stand." Harris rose from his seat in the gallery and made his way forward with the same measured pace he'd shown before. When he settled into the witness box, he adjusted his charcoal suit jacket once before folding his hands and giving the judge his full attention. Jenkins stood to question him, and there was a new energy in the public defender's movements. He'd spent the lunch recess reviewing the documents Harris had provided, and what he'd found had transformed his understanding of his own client. The exhausted resignation that had characterized his earlier performance had been replaced by something sharper, righteous anger mixed with professional determination. "Mr. Harris," Jenkins began, "you stated this morning that you were Mr. Booker's supervisor during his time in a federal documentation unit. Can you describe the nature of that work in more detail?" "Of course. The unit was part of a federal program established in the late 1960s, designed to provide specialized training in financial document analysis and forensic review. The program recruited individuals who demonstrated strong analytical capabilities, regardless of their formal educational credentials." "And how was Mr. Booker recruited?" "He came to our attention through a recommendation from a civil rights organization that was working to identify talented individuals who'd been denied educational opportunities due to segregation. He underwent a rigorous assessment process, written tests, practical evaluations, interviews. Out of more than 200 applicants that year, we accepted 15. Isaiah was one of them." Jenkins picked up a document from his table. "I have here a training certification dated August 1972. Can you tell the court what this represents?" Harris adjusted his glasses to look at the paper, though it was clear he already knew what it said. "That's Isaiah's completion certificate for the Advanced Financial Pattern Recognition course. It was a 6-month intensive program covering everything from basic accounting principles to complex fraud detection methodologies. And this was just one course? One of many. Over his first 3 years with us, Isaiah completed more than 3,000 hours of specialized training. He studied contract law, corporate financial structures, forensic accounting, document authentication, and evidentiary procedures." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The contrast between what Harris was describing and what Whitmore had presented was so stark it bordered on absurd. Jenkins let the moment breathe before continuing. "Mr. Harris, in your professional opinion, would someone with Mr. Booker's training be capable of understanding the financial documents at the center of this case?" "Absolutely. In fact, those documents are considerably less complex than many of the cases Isaiah worked on during his federal career. He regularly analyzed multi-million-dollar fraud schemes involving dozens of entities and hundreds of pages of documentation. Can you give the court an example?" Harris nodded. In 1987, Isaiah was the lead analyst on a case involving a sophisticated real estate fraud operation that had defrauded investors of over $40 million. The scheme involved shell companies, forged documents, and deliberately complex financial structures designed to hide the fraud. Isaiah spent 8 months analyzing the documentation and ultimately identified the pattern that broke the case open. His work led to 17 convictions. The courtroom was silent now, the earlier murmurs replaced by an almost stunned quiet. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, his expression intense. "And Mr. Booker received recognition for this work?" Jenkins asked. A flicker of something, frustration, perhaps, or old anger, crossed Harris's face. His work was instrumental to the case, yes. The recognition went primarily to more senior analysts and the supervising attorneys. Isaiah's contribution was acknowledged in internal reports, but he received no public commendation. Why not? Harris paused, choosing his words carefully. The program existed during a time when institutional racism was still very much present in federal agencies, even if it wasn't always explicit. Isaiah did the work. Others got the credit. It was a pattern that repeated throughout his career. Whitmore stood abruptly. Your Honor, I object to this characterization. We're not here to litigate historical employment practices. Sit down, Mr. Whitmore. Judge Harrison said flatly. You opened this door when you built your entire case around the defendant's capabilities. The witness is answering directly to that point. Whitmore sat, but his jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped visibly in his cheek. Jenkins continued. Mr. Harris, you mentioned Mr. Booker trained other analysts. Can you elaborate? Starting in the mid-'80s, Isaiah was assigned to mentor new recruits. He developed training modules, supervised casework, and evaluated performance. Several of the analysts he trained went on to leadership positions in other federal agencies. While Mr. Booker remained in an entry-level position, Harris confirmed, his voice neutral but the implication clear. Jenkins returned to his table and picked up another document. I have here a performance evaluation from 1989. It rates Mr. Booker as exceptional in every category. The supervising officer, that would be you, Mr. Harris, wrote that he, quote, demonstrates analytical capabilities superior to many analysts with advanced degrees. End quote. Is that accurate? That's my evaluation, yes. And it was accurate then and would be accurate now. So, when the prosecution argued that Mr. Booker lacked the education and intellectual capacity to understand the documents in this case, that argument was fundamentally false. Completely false. It wasn't just misleading, it was the opposite of the truth. The weight of those words settled over the courtroom like a physical presence. In the gallery, people who'd laughed at Isaiah's expense days earlier couldn't meet his eyes. Rachel Booker, sitting in the front row now, gripped her father's hand tightly. Jenkins glanced at his notes, then back at Harris. One final question. The prosecution claimed these federal employment records weren't available, that the search returned no results. Is that possible? No. The records are maintained in a federal database that's accessible through standard channels. When I learned about this trial and the arguments being made, I personally requested and received Isaiah's complete employment file within 72 hours. Any competent inquiry would have found them. Thank you, Mr. Harris. No further questions. Judge Harrison looked at the prosecution table. Mr. Whitmore, do you wish to cross-examine? Whitmore stood slowly. He looked like a man who knew he was about to make things worse for himself, but had no choice but to proceed. Mr. Harris, you've painted a very impressive picture of the defendant's past. But isn't it true that he left federal service over 30 years ago? 32 years ago, yes. And in those 32 years, he's worked as a janitor, a warehouse worker, a groundskeeper, correct? He worked in positions where his analytical skills weren't required or recognized, yes. Isn't it possible that his capabilities, however impressive they might have been decades ago, have diminished with age? Harris's expression hardened. Mr. Whitmore, I'm 73 years old. Do you believe my capabilities have diminished to the point where I couldn't understand a simple property transaction? A few people in the gallery laughed. Not at Isaiah this time, but at Whitmore's obvious trap. The prosecutor's face flushed. That's not what I'm suggesting, isn't it? You've spent this entire trial arguing that Isaiah couldn't possibly understand documents because of his age and background. You've mocked his education, questioned his intelligence, and treated him like a confused child. And now you're suggesting that even if he once had capabilities, age has taken them away. Which argument are you actually making, Mr. Whitmore? Your Honor, Whitmore appealed to the judge. You asked the question, counsel. The witness is entitled to respond. Whitmore tried a different approach. Mr. Harris, your obvious affection for the defendant is coloring your testimony. You're here to defend someone you used to supervise. That's admirable, but it doesn't make your assessment objective. You're absolutely right that I'm not objective, Harris replied calmly. I watched Isaiah spend 22 years doing exceptional work while being systematically denied advancement because of his race. I watched him train people who surpassed him professionally not because they were more capable, but because the system valued them more. So no, I'm not objective. I am accurate. Whitmore opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at his notes, then back at Harris, then at his notes again. Finally, he said, "No further questions," and sat down heavily. Judge Harrison turned to Jenkins. "Does the defense have additional witnesses?" "Yes, Your Honor." The defense calls Patricia Morrison. The court clerk walked to the witness stand with visible nervousness, but also with the determination of someone who decided that staying silent was no longer an option. She was sworn in, settled into the chair, and folded her hands in her lap, much as Isaiah habitually did, a small gesture of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed by those paying attention. Jenkins approached her gently. He could see she was scared, and he needed her testimony to be clear. "Ms. Morrison, how long have you worked in the courthouse?" 25 years this December. "And your role is?" "I'm a senior clerk. I manage court records, handle document filing and retrieval, maintain evidence logs. Basically, I keep track of everything that goes in and out of the court's possession." "So you're familiar with the discovery process?" "Very familiar. I process discovery requests for multiple courtrooms every week." "Can you tell the court about the discovery request filed in this case regarding Mr. Booker's federal employment history?" Patricia took a breath. The request was filed by Mr. Jenkins on September 4th. It was processed through standard channels, and the federal records were compiled and made available for pickup on September 23rd. According to our logs, they were included in the discovery materials provided to both the prosecution and defense. But Mr. Jenkins testified he never received those materials. "That's correct, and I know why." The courtroom leaned forward collectively. Whitmore's face had gone pale again. "Why?" Jenkins prompted. "On October 2nd, Mr. Whitmore checked out the complete discovery file from our office. That's not unusual. Attorneys often review the materials multiple times. But when he returned the file, 3 hours later, sections were missing." "How do you know sections were missing?" Patricia produced a folder from her lap. "Every file we maintain has a detailed index. When materials are checked out, we log exactly what's included. When they're returned, we verify against that log." When Mr. Whitmore returned the file, the federal employment records, approximately 40 pages, were no longer included. "And you documented this?" "I did. I flagged it immediately and reported it to my supervisor." "What happened then?" "I was told it was probably an administrative correction, that Mr. Whitmore had likely removed duplicates or irrelevant materials. I was told not to worry about it." She paused, but I kept worrying about it. So I made copies of all the logs and kept my own records. Jenkins took the folder from her and presented it to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter these documents into evidence." Judge Harrison reviewed the logs carefully, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finally looked up, he focused his attention on the prosecution table. "Mr. Whitmore, stand up." The prosecutor rose, his movement stiff. "According to these logs, you personally removed 40 pages of federal employment records from the discovery materials, records that directly contradicted the central argument of your case, records that you were legally obligated to disclose to the defense. Do you have an explanation?" Whitmore's voice was tight when he answered. "Your Honor, I reviewed the materials and made a judgment call about relevance. The defendant's employment history from decades ago didn't seem directly pertinent to the current charges." "Didn't seem pertinent." Judge Harrison's voice was deadly quiet. "You built your entire prosecution on the claim that Mr. Booker lacked the education and capability to understand financial documents. And you didn't think his 22-year career analyzing financial documents was pertinent." "Your Honor, I understand how it looks, but..." "How it looks?" The judge's voice rose for the first time. "Mr. Whitmore, this isn't about appearances. This is about Brady violations. This is about prosecutorial misconduct. This is about a man's freedom and reputation being sacrificed to your ambition." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes, transfixed by the spectacle of a judge openly rebuking a prosecutor. "Your Honor," Whitmore tried again, "if I could explain..." "You've explained enough. Ms. Morrison, did you personally witness Mr. Whitmore removing documents from a file? No, Your Honor. But the access logs clearly show he was the only person who checked out that file during the time period when the documents went missing. And these logs are automatically generated by your system? Yes, Your Honor. They're electronic and can't be altered after the fact. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. Thank you, Ms. Morrison. You may step down. He looked at Whitmore again. Mr. Whitmore, I'm formally notifying you that I will be referring this matter to the State Bar for investigation. I'm also referring it to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution. Whitmore swayed slightly, gripping the table for support. His career, everything he'd built, was collapsing in real time. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, given the egregious nature of these discovery violations and the fundamental flaws they've revealed in the prosecution's case, I'm granting the defense's motion to dismiss. All charges against Isaiah Booker are dismissed with prejudice. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the suddenly erupting courtroom. Rachel threw her arms around her father. Jenkins slumped in his chair with a mixture of relief and residual anger. Harris, still seated in the back, allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. He raised a hand, calling for silence, and the room gradually quieted. Before we adjourn, I want to say something for the record. He looked directly at Isaiah. Mr. Booker, you came into this courtroom and were subjected to mockery, condescension, and a prosecution that was fundamentally dishonest. You were denied the basic respect that every defendant deserves, and you endured it with a dignity that I, frankly, failed to protect as I should have. Isaiah met the judge's gaze, but said nothing. I allowed a tone in my courtroom that should never have been permitted. I failed to question assumptions that should have been questioned from the beginning. That failure is on me, and I apologize. The judge stood, signaling the session's end, but he paused at the bench. This case will serve as a reminder, to me, to this court, and hopefully to others, that our assumptions about people based on their appearance, their background, or their formal education can be not just wrong, but dangerously unjust. We're supposed to be better than that. We have to be better than that. With that, he left the bench. The courtroom dissolved into controlled chaos as reporters rushed to file stories. Spectators surged toward Isaiah, and court officers tried to maintain some semblance of order. Whitmore remained at the prosecution table, alone. His two assistant attorneys had quietly slipped out during the judge's speech. He gathered his materials slowly, mechanically, as if moving through water. When he finally stood to leave, he had to push through a crowd that parted reluctantly, their expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. Outside the courtroom, reporters cornered Whitmore, shouting questions he didn't answer. Camera flashes went off in his face as he tried to navigate toward the elevators. One reporter called out, "Mr. Whitmore, do you have any comment on the judge's referral to the State Bar?" He stopped, turned, and for a moment it looked like he might actually respond. But then his supervisor appeared, a severe woman in her 60s, and pulled him away with a firm grip on his elbow. "No comment," she said sharply. "The office will release a statement later." Inside the courtroom, Isaiah sat quietly as people approached to apologize, to congratulate, to explain why they'd never really doubted him. Most of their words rang hollow, and Isaiah accepted them with polite nods, but without warmth. Rachel stayed close to his side, protective and still processing everything she'd learned about her father's past. Harris approached slowly, waiting until there was a break in the crowd. When he reached Isaiah, the two men looked at each other for a long moment before Harris extended his hand. "You did good, Isaiah. You always did good." Isaiah took his hand. "Thank you for coming, James. You didn't have to." "Yes, I did. I owed you that much. I owed you a lot more than that, but it's a start. The past is the past." Harris shook his head slightly. "The past is never past." "Not really, but maybe we can make the present a little more just." He glanced at Rachel. "This your daughter?" "This is Rachel." "Rachel, this is James Harris. He was the best boss I ever had, even when he couldn't fix everything that was wrong." "I tried," Harris said quietly. "Not hard enough, maybe, but I tried." Rachel shook his hand. "Thank you for being here. for speaking up. He would have done the same for me. Did do the same once, though that's another story. Harris looked at Isaiah again. You gonna be all right? I've been through worse. I know. That's what makes this whole thing so infuriating. You shouldn't have had to go through this at all. As the crowd thinned, Jenkins approached with a stack of papers. Mr. Booker, there's some paperwork to complete, but it's mostly formalities. You're free to go. You're completely free. Isaiah nodded. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. You did better at the end than you thought you could. I should have done better from the beginning. We all should have, Isaiah said simply. But we learn. That's what matters. Evening news coverage that night was explosive. Every channel led with the story. Prosecutor caught hiding evidence in trial he built on mockery. Federal career hidden as elderly black man faced fraud charges. Judge issues rare apology to defendant after discovering withheld records. A legal commentator on one channel put it bluntly, this isn't just a case of prosecutorial error. This is a case of a prosecutor who deliberately withheld evidence that would have demolished his own argument. And he did it while publicly mocking the defendant for the very capabilities the hidden evidence proved he possessed. This is Brady Violation 101, and it's going to follow Daniel Whitmore for the rest of his career, however short that career might now be. In his downtown apartment, Whitmore watched the coverage with a bottle of scotch and a growing sense of unreality. His phone had been ringing constantly. Reporters, colleagues, his supervisor, his wife. He'd stopped answering hours ago. On the screen, footage of him leaving the courthouse played on a loop, his face pale and drawn, his eyes avoiding the cameras. How had this happened? The questions circled through his mind endlessly. It had seemed so simple, so straightforward. An elderly black man with no education, documents he couldn't possibly understand, a clear-cut case of fraud or confusion or both. It should have been easy, except Isaiah Booker hadn't been confused. He'd been patient, he'd been dignified, and he'd been right all along. Whitmore drained his glass and poured another. Tomorrow he'd have to face his supervisor, probably begin looking for a defense attorney of his own. His name was now attached to a case that would be taught in law schools as an example of everything a prosecutor shouldn't do. But tonight, he just sat in the dark and watched his career end on television. Meanwhile, across town in a small apartment that felt different now, lighter, somehow, Isaiah sat with Rachel on his worn couch. They'd ordered takeout, something Rachel had insisted on, and were eating in comfortable silence. Dad, Rachel said finally, why didn't you ever tell me about the federal work, the training, all of it? Isaiah was quiet for a moment. By the time you were old enough to understand, I'd already left that life behind. It felt like bragging about something that hadn't mattered anyway. I'd done the work, but the work never changed anything for me. So what was the point of talking about it? The point is it was yours. You earned it. You should have been proud. I was proud of the work. I was proud of doing it well. But pride doesn't pay rent, sweetheart. And it doesn't change how people see you. He set down his food and looked at her. I wanted you to build your own life, not spend it defending mine. I should have been here, Rachel said, her voice thick with emotion. When this started, when they were treating you like that, I should have been here. You're here now. That's what matters. You always say that. That's what matters. But sometimes the past matters too. Sometimes the time we lost matters. Isaiah took his daughter's hand. Then we won't lose anymore. How's that? Rachel leaned against his shoulder, and they sat that way for a long time, watching the city lights flicker through the window, grateful for second chances that came, even when they came late. The emergency hearing convened 3 days after Judge Harrison dismissed the charges against Isaiah Booker. The days between had been a whirlwind of media coverage, public outcry, and behind-the-scenes legal maneuvering. The state bar had moved with unusual speed to initiate its investigation, and the district attorney's office had assigned a special prosecutor to examine potential criminal charges against Daniel Whitmore. The courtroom was packed again, but the atmosphere was entirely different from the trial. Then, people had come expecting entertainment, a simple story of an unsophisticated man caught in something over his head. Now, they came as witnesses to accountability, drawn by the rare sight of the system actually correcting itself. Whitmore sat at a table with his attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Foster who specialized in defending lawyers accused of misconduct. He looked diminished, somehow, smaller than he had during the trial. His expensive suits still fit perfectly, but the confidence that had made them look natural was gone. He kept his eyes down, avoiding the gazes of people who'd once considered him a rising star in the prosecutor's office. Judge Harrison entered, and the room fell silent immediately. He'd spent the past 3 days reviewing every document, every transcript, every piece of evidence that had been withheld. What he'd found had only deepened his anger. This hearing concerns the conduct of Daniel Whitmore during the trial of the state versus Isaiah Booker, the judge began. The court has reviewed the complete record, including materials that should have been disclosed but were not. What I've discovered is not merely negligent, it's systematic. Margaret Foster stood. Your Honor, if I may address the court. You'll have your chance, Miss Foster. First, I want to establish the facts. Judge Harrison picked up a document. On September 4th, the defense filed a formal request for Mr. Booker's complete employment history. That request specifically mentioned potential federal employment. On September 23rd, those records were compiled and made available. On October 2nd, Mr. Whitmore personally removed them from the discovery file. He set down that document and picked up another. But it didn't stop there. On October 7th, Mr. Whitmore received a supplemental disclosure from the defense that referenced Mr. Booker's analytical background. Rather than investigating that reference, he filed a motion to exclude any testimony about the defendant's work history as irrelevant. He argued, and I quote, "The defendant's past employment in menial positions is not probative of his current mental state or capabilities." The courtroom murmured. The deliberateness of it was becoming clear. On October 15th, the judge continued. Mr. Whitmore interviewed 3 potential character witnesses who could have testified about Mr. Booker's analytical abilities. He chose not to call any of them. In fact, according to their statements, he specifically told them their testimony wouldn't be needed because the case was straightforward. Margaret Foster's expression remained neutral, but there was a tightness around her eyes that suggested she was recalculating her defense strategy with each revelation. Most significantly, Judge Harrison said, his voice hardening, Mr. Whitmore had multiple conversations with his supervising attorney about the strength of his case. In those conversations, documented in email and text messages that have been provided to this court, he expressed certainty that the defendant couldn't possibly mount an effective defense because of his obvious limitations. When his supervisor suggested conducting more thorough background research, Mr. Whitmore responded that it would be a waste of resources. The judge set down the papers and looked directly at Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, this wasn't an oversight. This wasn't an error in judgment. This was a deliberate strategy to secure a conviction by hiding the truth. Margaret Foster stood again. Your Honor, my client acknowledges that mistakes were made in the handling of discovery materials. However, we contest the characterization that this was deliberate misconduct. Mr. Whitmore made judgment calls about relevance, as prosecutors do in every case. Those judgments may have been flawed, but that doesn't constitute criminal behavior or warrant disbarment. Judgment calls about relevance, Judge Harrison repeated. Ms. Foster, your client built his entire case on the claim that Mr. Booker lacked the capacity to understand financial documents. Evidence proving that Mr. Booker spent 22 years analyzing financial documents is not a relevance question. It's the heart of the case. Your Honor, I'm not finished. During the trial, Mr. Whitmore repeatedly mocked the defendant's education and intelligence. He invited the courtroom to laugh at Mr. Booker's expense. He created an atmosphere of ridicule that I, to my shame, allowed to continue, all while in possession of evidence that would have made those mockeries not just inappropriate, but actively false. The judge opened another folder. I've also reviewed Mr. Whitmore's case history. This is not an isolated incident. In the past 4 years, he's had 3 other cases where defense attorneys raised concerns about late or incomplete discovery. In 2 of those cases, convictions were overturned on appeal. Those reversals are currently being re-examined in light of what we've learned here. Whitmore's head came up sharply at that. The implications were clear. This wasn't just about the Booker case anymore. His entire career was being scrutinized. Patricia Morrison was called to testify again, this time with even more detailed documentation. She walked through the electronic access logs systematically, showing not just that Whitmore had removed documents, but that he'd accessed the discovery file multiple times, always removing or relocating materials that would have helped the defense. On October 9th, she testified. Mr. Whitmore checked out the file and removed a section containing performance evaluations from Mr. Booker's federal employment. On October 21st, he removed training certifications. On November 2nd, he removed correspondence between federal supervisors discussing Mr. Booker's analytical abilities. And each time, the prosecutor questioning her asked, he was the only person to access the file during the period when materials went missing? Yes. The electronic logs are definitive on that point. Did you ever directly confront Mr. Whitmore about these missing materials? Patricia hesitated. I mentioned the discrepancies to my supervisor. I was told that Mr. Whitmore was managing the file appropriately and that I shouldn't question his professional judgment. But you kept your own records anyway. Yes, because I knew it wasn't right. I've worked in this courthouse for 25 years. I know the difference between file management and evidence suppression. When it was Margaret Foster's turn to cross-examine, she tried to create doubt about the electronic logs, suggesting they could have been misinterpreted or that others might have had access. But Patricia had anticipated every argument and had documentation for everything. The logs were time-stamped, automatically generated, and backed up on secure servers. There was no ambiguity. James Harris was called next, and his testimony was devastating in its precision. He brought not just employment records, but personal documentation, letters of commendation that had never been officially filed, internal memos praising Isaiah's work, training materials that Isaiah himself had developed. I kept these, Harris explained, because I knew Isaiah wasn't getting the recognition he deserved through official channels. I thought someday they might matter. I never imagined it would be like this. The prosecutor walked him through Isaiah's career systematically. Every major case he'd worked on, every skill he'd demonstrated, every instance where his analysis had been crucial. By the time Harris finished, it was impossible to maintain the fiction that Isaiah was anything other than an expert in exactly the area Whitmore had claimed he knew nothing about. Mr. Harris, the prosecutor asked, in your professional opinion, if Mr. Whitmore had conducted even a basic inquiry into Mr. Booker's background, would he have discovered this federal employment history? Without question, it's in the federal database. It would have appeared in any standard background check. If Mr. Whitmore didn't find it, it's because he didn't look, or because he chose to ignore what he found. Margaret Foster objected. Speculation. Sustained, Judge Harrison said. Though I'll note that Mr. Harris's opinion is based on 30 years of experience with federal employment records. The hearing stretched across 2 full days. Witnesses testified to Whitmore's pattern of aggressive prosecution combined with minimal investigation. Former defendants spoke about feeling railroaded, about evidence that emerged too late, about a prosecutor more interested in winning than in justice. On the second day, Isaiah himself was called to testify. He'd been reluctant to participate, telling Rachel the night before that he just wanted to move on with his life. But Jenkins had convinced him that his testimony mattered, not for revenge, but for the record. Isaiah took the stand with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout the trial. The prosecutor questioning him was gentle, walking him through his experience of the trial without forcing him to relive the worst moments. Mr. Booker, when Mr. Whitmore mocked your education in court, you knew you had federal training that contradicted everything he was saying. Why didn't you speak up more forcefully? Isaiah was quiet for a moment. I've spent my whole life watching people make assumptions about what I could or couldn't do based on how I looked, how I talked, where I came from. Speaking up doesn't always change those assumptions. Sometimes it just makes people more determined to prove they're right. But you had proof. You had documentation. I had documentation that my own attorney didn't have access to. I couldn't very well pull federal employment records out of thin air. And even if I tried to explain, who would have believed me? An elderly black man with no high school diploma, claiming he used to analyze fraud cases for the government. It sounds made up, but it wasn't made up. No, sir. It was my life. 22 years of my life that got erased from the record because it was inconvenient for the prosecution's narrative. The courtroom was silent. Even Margaret Foster didn't attempt to cross-examine. When the hearing concluded, Judge Harrison took a full day to prepare his ruling. On the third day, the courtroom filled again for what everyone knew would be the final word. I've reviewed all testimony and evidence presented, the judge began. I've examined the electronic records, the witness statements, and Mr. Whitmore's own communications. The pattern is clear and disturbing. Mr. Whitmore did not simply fail to disclose exculpatory evidence. He actively concealed it, repeatedly and systematically, over a period of several months. He looked at Whitmore directly. You weaponized Mr. Booker's lack of formal education against him while hiding evidence that he possessed specialized training that exceeded what many lawyers receive. You invited mockery and ridicule while suppressing the truth. You sought a conviction not through justice, but through deception. Margaret Foster stood. Your Honor, we respectfully disagree with that characterization. I'm sure you do, but the evidence supports no other conclusion. Judge Harrison picked up his prepared ruling. I'm recommending to the State Bar that Mr. Whitmore be disbarred. I am also formally referring this matter to the District Attorney for criminal prosecution under statutes prohibiting prosecutorial misconduct and evidence tampering. Whitmore's face went white. Disbarment and criminal charges. His legal career was over, and he might face prison time. Furthermore, the judge continued, I am ordering a review of every case Mr. Whitmore has prosecuted in the past 5 years. Any defendant who believes they were denied a fair trial due to suppressed evidence will have the opportunity to petition for post-conviction relief. The implications rippled through the courtroom. This wasn't just about Isaiah anymore. It was about every person Whitmore had prosecuted, every conviction he'd secured, every sentence he'd advocated for. Finally, Judge Harrison said, his voice softening slightly, I want to address the broader implications of this case. What happened here was not just the failure of one prosecutor. It was a failure of supervision, a failure of institutional oversight, and yes, a failure of this court to recognize bias when it was happening in front of me. He paused, choosing his words carefully. We have systems designed to ensure fairness, but those systems only work if we actively resist our own prejudices and assumptions. We failed Isaiah Booker. We allowed a man to be prosecuted and humiliated based on stereotypes rather than facts. That failure should haunt every person involved in this case, myself included. The gavel came down with a finality that seemed to mark the end of more than just a hearing. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Whitmore left through a side exit, his attorney running interference. He said nothing, his face a mask of shock, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding what he'd lost. Isaiah, by contrast, walked out the front entrance with Rachel at his side and James Harris just behind them. He paused at the top of the courthouse steps, and the reporters surged forward with their cameras and microphones. Mr. Booker, how do you feel about the judge's ruling? Do you think justice was served? Will you pursue a civil suit against Mr. Whitmore? Isaiah raised one hand, and gradually the shouting subsided. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured, carrying easily in the suddenly quiet morning air. I'm grateful that the truth came out. I'm grateful to Mr. Harris for speaking up, to Ms. Morrison for keeping records when she knew something wasn't right, and to Judge Harrison for acknowledging his own mistakes. That takes courage. What about Mr. Whitmore? A reporter called out. Do you have anything to say to him? Isaiah, consider the question. I hope he learns from this. I hope he understands that the people he prosecutes are human beings with complicated lives and hidden depths. We're not just cases to be won. We're people who deserve to be seen as we actually are, not as we appear to be. Are you angry? I've been angry before about a lot of things. But anger takes energy I don't have to spare. I'd rather spend my time with my daughter, rebuilding things that matter. He declined further questions and made his way down steps. The reporters let him go, sensing that pushing further would be disrespectful. As Isaiah reached the sidewalk, A few spectators who'd been watching from the edges of the crowd began to applaud. The applause spread, growing until it filled the courthouse plaza. Isaiah didn't acknowledge it with more than a slight nod. He simply walked away with Rachel, heading toward the rest of his life. The weeks that followed brought profound changes, though not the dramatic kind that made for sensational headlines. Whitmore was formally disbarred within a month. The criminal charges took longer to develop, but eventually he pled guilty to evidence tampering and received a suspended sentence along with probation and community service. His legal career was over, and he took a job in his brother-in-law's insurance firm, processing claims in quiet anonymity. The review of his previous cases yielded 3 overturned convictions and 7 cases where defendants received reduced sentences or new trials. The prosecutor's office implemented new oversight procedures, mandatory ethics training, and a system where discovery materials were independently verified by a clerk not assigned to the prosecuting attorney. Judge Harrison, for his part, became an outspoken advocate for judicial awareness of implicit bias. He gave talks at law schools, wrote articles for legal journals, and never shied away from acknowledging his own failure in the Booker case. Some people praised him for his honesty. Others felt he was trying to rehabilitate his image. He didn't particularly care which. He just kept doing the work. Patricia Morrison received a commendation for her integrity and was promoted to a senior administrative position where she helped develop the new oversight protocols. She kept the photo from the courthouse steps, Isaiah walking away with dignity, on her desk as a reminder of why accuracy and honesty in record-keeping mattered. James Harris visited Isaiah once a month, usually bringing coffee and staying for a few hours. They talked about old cases, old colleagues, old frustrations. Gradually, those conversations shifted to include new things: Rachel's career, Harris's grandchildren, books they were reading, places they'd like to visit someday. "I still feel like I should have done more," Harris said one afternoon, 6 months after the trial. "When we worked together, I should have fought harder for your promotions, your recognition. You did what you could in the system you were in," Isaiah replied. "And when it mattered most, you showed up. That's what I'll remember." Isaiah's life returned to a rhythm that felt familiar but different. He still lived in the same small apartment, still took the bus, still lived simply. But now, when he walked through his neighborhood, people knew who he was. Some recognized him from the news coverage and nodded respectfully. Others didn't know the specifics, but sensed something in his bearing that commanded quiet acknowledgement. He declined most interview requests, though he did agree to speak at a community center event about education and opportunity. His message was simple: formal education matters, but it's not the only kind of education that counts. Life teaches, experience teaches, necessity teaches. The question isn't what credentials someone has, but whether we're willing to recognize competence wherever we find it. Rachel moved back to the city, not into her father's apartment, but into a place nearby. She'd realized during the trial that the distance she'd put between herself and her father had been about her own discomfort with where she came from, not about him at all. She'd wanted to escape what she saw as his limitations, only to discover that the limitations had never been his. They'd been the system's, and partly her own narrow vision. They had dinner together twice a week, sometimes more. They talked about things they'd never discussed before: his years in the federal program, her struggles with imposter syndrome in corporate America, the ways they'd both been shaped by trying to prove they belonged in spaces that questioned their presence. "You never told me you were proud of me," Rachel said one evening over takeout Chinese food. "Of course I was proud of you. I am proud of you. But you never said it. You never talked about your own accomplishments either. It was like you were teaching me to be invisible." Isaiah set down his chopsticks, considering. "I was teaching you to survive. In the world I grew up in, being visible got you hurt. Keeping your head down, doing the work without expecting credit. That was how you made it through. But that's not how I want to live." "I know, and you shouldn't. The world's different now, or at least it's supposed to be. You should take up space. You should be visible. I want that for you." He paused. "I guess I never learned how to want it for myself. Maybe you could learn now." Isaiah smiled. "Maybe I'm starting to." A year after the trial, the local bar association invited Isaiah to speak at their annual ethics conference. He almost declined, Public speaking had never been comfortable for him, but Rachel convinced him to accept. He stood at the podium in a hotel conference room filled with lawyers, judges, and law students, and talked about his experience with a clarity that surprised even himself. He didn't shy away from the pain of being mocked, the frustration of watching evidence being suppressed, the exhaustion of maintaining dignity in the face of deliberate disrespect. But he also talked about the people who'd done the right thing. Harris, Morrison, even Judge Harrison's eventual willingness to admit his failures. He talked about systems and how they fail, but also about individuals and how they can choose to be better than the systems they work in. When he finished, the room gave him a standing ovation. Afterward, young lawyers and law students lined up to talk to him, to apologize on behalf of a profession that had failed him, to promise they'd try to do better. One young black woman, a first-year law student, waited until the crowd thinned before approaching. "Mr. Booker, I just wanted to say thank you. I've been thinking about quitting law school because I keep feeling like I don't belong, like I'm not smart enough. Watching what you went through and how you handled it, it reminded me that the problem isn't always us. Sometimes the problem is people who can't see what's right in front of them." Isaiah took her hand gently. "Don't quit. The profession needs people who understand what it's like to be underestimated. Just promise me you'll remember this feeling when you're the one with power. Remember what it's like to be on the other side." "I promise." 2 years after the trial, Isaiah was invited to a small ceremony at the federal building. The program he'd worked for had been officially defunct for decades, but some former colleagues had organized a reunion and recognition event. 37 former analysts attended, including several who'd been trained by Isaiah and had gone on to significant careers in law enforcement and federal agencies. One of them, now a deputy director at the Treasury Department, gave a speech that brought Isaiah close to tears. "Isaiah Booker taught me to see patterns where others saw chaos. He taught me patience, precision, and the importance of being thorough even when no one was watching. He was the best analyst in our unit, and it's long past time we acknowledged that officially." They presented him with a plaque, a formal commendation that should have been given decades earlier. It was a small thing, a gesture that couldn't undo years of being overlooked and undervalued. But it mattered because it was true, and because it was public, and because it meant that at least some part of the record had been corrected. In the audience, Rachel watched her father accept the honor with quiet grace, and she finally understood something she'd been too young to see before. His humility had never been weakness. It had been strength tempered by a lifetime of knowing that pride could be dangerous, that visibility could be fatal, that survival sometimes meant accepting less than you deserved and finding dignity in that acceptance anyway. But that was then. This was now. And now, finally, he was being seen. 3 years after the trial, Isaiah published a short op-ed in the local paper. It wasn't about his case specifically, but about the assumptions we make about people based on incomplete information. He wrote about the dangers of judging competence by credentials alone, about the cost of dismissing people whose intelligence doesn't fit conventional patterns, about the moral obligation to look deeper than surface appearances. The op-ed was reprinted in several legal publications and sparked a broader conversation about reforming how courts assess defendants' capabilities and credibility. It wasn't a revolution, but it was something, a small crack in old assumptions, a tiny shift in how some people thought about justice. Isaiah didn't write any more op-eds. He'd said what he needed to say. But occasionally, when law students or reporters asked for interviews, he'd agree, always with the same message. Everyone deserves to be seen accurately, completely, and with respect for their full humanity. It wasn't a complicated philosophy, but it was one that the world kept forgetting and needed to keep relearning. On a quiet Tuesday morning, 4 years after the trial, Isaiah sat in his apartment with a cup of coffee and the newspaper. There was nothing in it about him. He'd become old news, which suited him fine. Rachel was coming for dinner. Harris had called the day before to share a story about his grandson. The morning was peaceful, ordinary, exactly what he'd wanted all along. His phone buzzed with a text message from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Booker, my name is David Thompson. I was one of the analysts you trained in 1989. I just wanted you to know that I tell my team about you all the time, about your patience, your precision, your integrity. You made me better at my job, and I've tried to make others better at theirs. Thank you for everything you taught me. Isaiah read the message twice, then typed back, "Thank you for remembering. Keep teaching. It matters more than you know." He set down the phone and returned to his coffee, to his newspaper, to his quiet morning. Outside his window, the city moved through its routines, people rushing to work, children heading to school, the endless flow of life continuing as it always did. They'd mocked what he'd never had, never realizing what he'd spent a lifetime mastering. But in the end, the truth had emerged, as truth eventually does when enough people care enough to look for it. And that, Isaiah thought, settling deeper into his chair, was something worth more than all the recognition he'd been denied. It was justice, imperfect delay but real. And for a man who'd learned early that justice was rare and precious, that was enough. When someone stands before you with trembling hands and a quiet voice, do you see weakness, or do you see a lifetime of strength you haven't bothered to understand? If you found this story powerful, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that challenge how we see the world around us.